Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest. Good morning, Slava.
Hey, Jonathan, how you faring?
I am faring pretty well. Another solid week under the belt, and we're here reading and talking about books in our casual book club for those of you who are tuning in.
Take any trips to Kuwait lately?
I have not, thankfully. At least based on this timeline or multiverse.
So you haven't followed a pseudo-messiah to your destruction like our friend Naughton, mutilating a child tied to a post in Kuwait?
I have not. Or have I not done?
Tried
to fit his
well
last
done.
name there. And
no, that's
not
perfect.
so much.
I love it. I love it. Not and I like a good pun.
See what you did there. I don't have another Naughton joke. I was trying to think of something.
It's a difficult name. There's only like 2 or 3 puns, and I think we exhausted them already.
Yeah, I call him Travis, but that's just me.
Travis
Naughton.
Okay.
Well,
moving on.
Let's move into the episode. Let's move into the episode. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Before we do that, make sure you smash that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest. Slava, why don't you give us a quick overview of the book?
I would love to, because there's nothing like a good overview of a book.
Okay. It's going to go on the whole time.
It's going to be a thing. So, our book. Mary Kate is an average woman working as a waitress in a diner in New York, married to a former English major who now drives a taxi. One night, she's attacked in a New York alley by a man who is far from ordinary. The assault leaves her pregnant, and she and her husband decide to name the child Jeffrey. However, a strange force begins to tear their family apart, causing the couple to turn against each other. Eventually, consumed by hatred for her husband, Mary Kate kills him and is sent to prison while Jeffrey is sent to an orphanage. There he takes the name Baal and begins to exhibit sinister powers that grow stronger as he gets older. When Baal becomes an adult, his evil threatens the entire world. And I'm going to read you a little blurb from the cover of a paperback edition of Baal. A woman is ravaged, and unto her a child is born, unleashing an unimaginable evil upon the world. And they call him Baal in the orphanage, where he leads the children on a rampage of violence. In California, where he appears as the head of a deadly Mason-like cult. And in Kuwait, where Jonathan met him, where crazed millions heed his call to murder and orgy. Then they call him Baal in the Arctic's hellish wasteland, where he is tracked by the only 3 men who will stop him. Zark the shaman, Virga the aging professor of theology, and Michael, the powerful and mysterious stranger. Baal is written by Robert MacCammon. He's an accomplished author of 23 novels and 2 short story collections. He became one of the best-selling horror authors of the 1980s, winning several Bram Stoker Awards for Best Novel and Best Short Story. He later expanded his writing to historical fiction and contemporary novels. His latest work is the Matthew Corbet series, with the 7th book being published in 2019, and Baal is his first published book when he was 25. He says this about it. Baal is my Angry Man novel. It was also my first published novel and the first book I ever tried to write. I think that Baal, you can feel the friction of shoulders being squeezed by iron walls, my shoulders pressing against the walls of a dead-end job. Baal is about power, written at a time when I had none.
Interesting stuff.
This is my second time reading the book. I really like the book. I don't know if I would put it in top 5, maybe, depending on how I feel that day, put it in my top 10. First time I read it, the second time I read it, I like the pacing. I like the use of words. I think he's a pretty good wordsmith, fantastic wordsmith, actually. But I want to get your first assumptions or takeaways. This is your first time reading it. You're only halfway through the book. You don't know what's coming. Talk about that.
I don't know what's coming. I made a comment to you while I was reading the first half of the book that even though it jumps around, the story is easy enough to follow, which is good. Also, this book is much creepier than Head Full of Ghosts, which we just read recently.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah.
And not being well acquainted with the horror genre, I really don't know what to expect outside of the fact that this is a creepier book. And I'm looking forward to it. The pacing, similar to what you said, the pacing's been great. It's very snappy, and it feels like the story is being told to me in almost a dreamlike state because it's so snappy.
Okay.
We don't sit anywhere for very long, which is nice. My only thing that has stood out to me from a storytelling perspective is I almost feel like the book would be even creepier if the part 2 that I'm in, where we're following the reporter in Kuwait, that book opens with that, and then it jumps back in time to give me this understanding about Baal and his upbringing, and literally just swapping those two things. Again, I don't know where the story's going, so that could be a terrible suggestion because I've only read half of it. So
maybe a point of clarification. By reporter, you don't mean Virga, the professor. You mean the actual reporter that Virga meets that gets murdered. I'm not spoiling much for you. It might be right around where you ended or right in the next chapter, and that's not a big plot point, the guy getting murdered. But Virga is not a reporter. He is a professor of theology going after Naughton.
I thought Naughton was a reporter.
He's called a reporter by some of the locals, but he's not a reporter. He's a writer. He works with Virga in the theology department, and this is a book on messianic figures that he's writing, and he gets swept up into the thing that Baal is weaving.
Right. I forgot that he was coming from the theological seminary, and just remember him being a reporter because I read it early last week in between all my MBA stuff. So
yeah, well, everybody calls him a reporter. When they meet him, they're like, locals are like, "Are you a reporter?" And he constantly has to remind them that no, he's not a reporter.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So when I say reporter, I was talking about Travis.
Gotcha. So that might be an interesting way of looking at it. I think as I'm processing what you said, it might add some confusion if not done correctly, obviously, right? But it almost does something similar to what you have said. It gives us a prologue. I'm not exactly sure where the prologue takes place. I'm assuming it's before any of the characters we meet in present day, because Baal is destroyed in the prologue, the way I understand it. And then we just fast forward into modern day New York, which is the time they're writing is the 80s. So that's kind of done. I almost think if we got a glimpse of what Baal was like in the future, it would have kind of ruined his story as a kid. Because you see him in this, loveless marriage. You see him in an orphanage, and you're thrown in the deep end with him being this evil little shit. And then you kind of figured out, okay, he's Baal, because not only he's calling himself Baal, but he is going to do things that are pale in comparison to what that herdsman from the prologue mentions, right? I think it's a fun idea. But for a story like this, with the essential character, the way McCammon laid it out, it might not work, but I'm not dismissing it.
Sure. And I don't know. I'm not familiar with the back half of the book. We'll talk about that in the next episode because I haven't read it yet. So I'm interested to see where it goes. I don't know, outside of just being a creepy book, I'm not sure what the author is trying to convey yet, outside of similar to what you just said. It's a book on power, which I didn't know that it was his first published novel, because it doesn't feel like his first published novel.
No, it doesn't.
It feels like he's mid-career with this book, where it's well written, the dialogue's good, the pacing's good. That impresses me that this is his first published novel.
There's a couple of quotes that I want to read to you maybe shine a light on this. He talked about this being an angry young man book, and this is his angry young man book, and he was 25 when he wrote it. He was working at a department store downtown in Birmingham, Alabama. That's where he's from. I mistakenly mentioned him as being an English writer in an episode like a while back. But nevertheless, so he's from Birmingham, Alabama. And he says, people often ask me where I get my ideas. I always say that each character, whether male or female, is put together from observation, memory, and is part of the author too. I really believe that it's part of me in all the characters, not only the good ones. The character of Baal, with his unleashed wild power and his ability to do just about anything he pleases, is certainly the part of what I was feeling at that time in my life. I was an electric plug, and I couldn't seem to find the right socket until I began writing. So, not a direct answer to your question, but I think it illuminates the prowess of Robert MacCammon. Dead-end job. He doesn't know what he's doing with his life, but he feels like this outlet is something that is necessary for him almost. I'm almost putting words in his mouth. I'm just extrapolating this from the few quotes I have online from his blog. So this is his own words.
Right.
And he seems to just be able to grasp onto something and craft this world, craft these characters. Like the observation stuff, he talks about memory and putting himself into it. So he says another thing here. You always hear this said to young writers, write what you know. I wanted to write about things I didn't know. So I consciously said Baal in locations so far from the South as possible. Boston, the Middle East, Greenland. I wanted a global scale of a story that would take the reader to the very edge of Armageddon. And I hope I succeeded. I think with a guy like that, so with his determination and his imagination, he set out to do something that is difficult. And again, this is me extrapolating from a little bit I see here on his blog. He was able to take something, to research it, to make it digestible and believable to the reader, because he put so much of himself and so much energy into it. And all that, now that I'm done kissing his ass, all that to say, the wordsmithing is unbelievable. You can tell that even though this is his first published novel, he's written before. This is the plug that, or the whatever, he's the plug, the socket, whatever the hell the analogy was that I just read. He had to have practiced before. And when he finally sat down to do it and like, this is what I'm going to do with my life, it came out of him.
It's moments like this in the podcast that I show up for, where you've done extra research and you reveal to me something about an author. And this is primarily for these books that I've never read, nor would have thought to read. Horror, speculative fiction, things like that. I wanted to set this book in destinations as far from what I knew as possible. They say, write what you know. I wanted to write what I didn't know. That's super telling about who he is as a person, which is really fun. And even more so, it goes, wow, I'm more impressed because of that.
For sure. No, I really love this story. And more than, the darkness and the creepiness of it, which I love, and the audience knows that I love, I want to read a quote that is just fan-frickin-tastic. It's something that gripped me. And it's a very simple quote in this book, but it's absolutely amazing. So this is from the argument that Mary Kate and her deadbeat husband have. Right where she tells him she's keeping the kid no matter what. He slumped back on the sofa, wanting instinctively to lengthen the distance between himself and the woman whose white teeth glittered in the darkness. And here's the quote. She had placed defeat like a crown of black thorns on his head. Her face as lifeless and determined as some ancient concrete death mask, ate its way past his eyes and hung marionette-like in his brain, dancing there like a grim shade of what she had been only a few moments before. He shuddered suddenly and wondered why. In an empty, toneless voice, he said, "You're killing me, Mary Kate. I don't know why or how, but you're killing me all the same." Dude, I couldn't pull that out of my ass if I wrote for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like on page 40. And the book is full of those kind of descriptions. It's telling of the fact that some of this writing stuff is a gift too. Yes, anybody can become a writer. Not everybody will be successful or good, but just like some people are just adept at sports, they still need to practice. Otherwise, they won't be able to perform in the field. But sometimes a writer just has a thing, like his brain just works in a different type of way. And I think Robert MacCammon is that writer, just based on little stuff like that, little quotes, like how he can describe a whole season, a whole passing of time in 3 sentences, and you're like, oh, that must have been a difficult time for Mary Kate, and now we're in this new phase, and all of that is expressed in 3 sentences instead of 40 pages of exposition,
right?
Which could work too, but when you run across something like this, I'm always amazed. And this is my first and only book I read by Robert MacCammon. And it was similar to how I found A Head Full of Ghosts. I began to research, and I did a Google search on horror books. And instead of picking the top 10 of last 10 years like I did with A Head Full of Ghosts, let's see what writers did 20, 30 years ago besides Stephen King. I came upon this guy. And I was like, well, Baal seems to be all over the place on
Give
YouTube.
him a shot, right?
Let's give it a shot, yeah.
Interesting. I was going to ask you how you found him, but you already told me, so
Yeah.
we're good there.
Yeah.
In terms of story here, I love the pacing. I think the jumping around is impressive because it doesn't feel clunky, and I like the creepiness of the plot that's been spelled out so far. But what's curious to me is I don't feel like there's been any foreshadowing yet, and maybe he doesn't use any foreshadowing. Not everybody does, and I'm not even sure if horror books would do well with foreshadowing. And in fact, speaking about horror as a genre for a minute, and then let's get back into the story, I had a question for you earlier this week on why most horror books are short. And this is something that I prompted to Slava as I'm reading this, because I'm like, I'm halfway through the book. I'm interested, but I was thinking, why do we not have lengthy horror books like a Stormlight Archives or A Name of the Wind, these fantasy novels that are just really long? And I don't have an answer to this. It's just a question that I came up with. So I asked Slava, and I'm wondering if you had any more thoughts on this. The reason that I came up with was maybe we don't have longer horror books because we as people can't handle the emotional weight of a longer drawn-out book in the horror genre, which usually doesn't end with a happy ending. That's just my theory.
I think you're right to a degree. I think most horror books are short for 2 reasons. One of them is the one you said. It's, to pack in a story, not to draw out the horror and the evil and everything, because after a while you're like, I think a person might get overwhelmed. And maybe publishers, editors, and authors think that. And also, a lot of these authors are popular writers. And so popular books, when I say popular writers, I'm thinking John Grisham, stuff like that. It's stuff you could see, maybe at an airport. And that's not to denigrate them at all. It's just what popular fiction is. They're usually short. Now, you have your outliers like Stephen King, who's also a popular writer and a horror writer, who has books that are 1,000 pages. Like Tommyknockers, I'm reading now, It, The Stand. These are all horror books, although Tommyknockers is more sci-fi. But nonetheless, it's a horror-esque or has horror elements in it. They're all 1,000+ pages. And I looked up, I think I sent this to you. I looked up longest horror books on our trusty little Google. There's Between Two Fires comes up. I don't know who Christopher Buckman is. I think that's his name. That's 438 pages. There's The House of Leaves. That's like 1,000-some pages too. There's other books that are long.
Yeah, it's just something that came to mind. We don't need a final answer, but it's just something that I thought was interesting. In terms of the plot itself, I thought it was curious that when Mary Kate has her assault and is raped, it's noted that there was no seminal discharge, and then she has a baby. Is this answered later, or is it just, a believable thing that because this is a supernatural book, supernatural things occur, and it's just something we believe?
Right. So the latter. It's never answered to my recollection.
Sure.
Yeah, this is my second time reading it. It's never answered to my recollection. And when I sent you that, my sarcastic response is, supernatural demon semen.
Mm-hmm.
It was being tongue in cheek, but I think that's what we're supposed to assume, that this beggar, this hobo, who is obviously possessed by Baal, and we don't know why he's possessed by this. Is this him passing himself on to another host? That's never answered. But the guy whose hands are like fire and leaves sort of lasting imprints on Mary-Kate's body of first-degree burns, whatever seminal discharge there is won't be what a normal human attacker would leave behind. So I think that's just assumed.
Okay.
That goes back to some of the time jumps. In some way, in my mind, it goes back to how Robert MacCammon just leaves some things hanging for your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's never explicitly said that Mary-Kate goes to trial and goes to jail. But where else will she go after stabbing her husband and making him fall out of the window, right?
Right. I did note that you mentioned that, and I was like, I don't remember reading that she went to jail, but we do see him in an orphanage, and the father and nuns were like, well, you know what happened to him? And it's like, well, I know that his mom stabbed her dad, so the fact that they're not explicitly stated, I think works well, but I didn't realize that until you pointed it out.
Right. And I was waiting for you to say something, because your critiques of a lot of books, or what your desire is from a lot of books, or both, is I want a little bit more. I want a little bit more explained. I don't want to always guess some things, where I am interested to see what Jonathan will say about the jumps in time here, and some of the things that are just kind of left to the imagination. So I'm glad that you like it. And that goes back to McCammon's prowess as a writer. If he could get somebody as, I don't want to say critical as you, as detailed as you, as the word, whatever your this particular desire of yours when you go into a book, if he could satisfy it and still leave room for the imagination, I think another notch on McCammon's belt.
Well, I don't know if it's satisfied as much as it was, there's bigger things that have drawn my attention.
Okay.
I notice it even right now, where it's like, okay, Baal comes out as a child. He's notably burned people later. We don't see that earlier, but is the burning a choice? Like, there's a lot of questions, and I've just kind of pushed those aside to go, I'm still not exactly sure what's going on in the book, and I think it's that mystery that has captured my attention that has prevented me from wondering, well, it's prevented me from giving attention to other parts of the book that I would normally question.
Okay, that's fair.
But it's not a bad thing. I think the more that I read books where there's mystery, I am beginning to see why it's enjoyable. But another question that I had was, and this is probably just the mystery thing, but I don't feel, even though the narrator's third-person omniscient, which is we get to see multiple character perspectives and their inner thoughts throughout the story, I don't see the father having a valid unction for why he's trying to kill the child. It's just he starts doing it, and then he's like, oh, you caught me. Like, why didn't he just drop the child in the boiling water or whatever?
Good question. And my answer to you, because you brought this up earlier too in our discussions, and my quick answer to you was because the kid is evil and it has a supernatural effect on people who are susceptible and weak. And the dad is susceptible and weak. We can tell from his quitting school, from his shacking up with a waitress that he never loved and is only a sex thing, but he just kind of fell into the habit. And now Mary-Kate is his wife, and he can't escape that. And he even gave up, I guess, a trust fund for her, which I suppose if it was true love, whatever the hell that is, fine. And that might make for an interesting story. But you admit to yourself and to the audience, yeah, it was just a sex thing with this waitress. And then the parents are painted, at least from the father's perspective, as these rich snobs who don't want a dirty waitress in their, whatever mansion. But who knows what really happened. He tells them to go to hell, and then here they are, Mary-Kate and him, in a, roach-filled apartment, I guess, or at least a slummy apartment, and their lives are falling apart. But anyway, I digress. I think the kid just exudes a certain amount of evil because he is the spawn of Baal, whoever that hobo was. So he already has a self-awareness that other children don't.
Sure.
I think he exploits the father's depression and self-loathing and the hatred he has for this kid that's not his. Because even when he's making love to his wife later, which supposedly this is when he gets her pregnant, but then it turns out we, the audience, know this is not who the real father is.
Right.
Even then, all he can think about is his wife being ravaged by somebody else. So there's probably some hidden shame and hidden anger at the wife, or hidden, I don't know the right term for it is, undealt issues, right? Still doesn't answer your question completely, because we're not given that by McCammon here. And maybe that's to his fault. Maybe that's a misstep on his part as an author, or at least in this story, where we're not given any idea of why the father wants to kill him. Everywhere he goes later, people kill each other and go completely nuts because he's a demon. But that's the best I can do.
Well, that's fine. It's just one of those moments where something is about to happen, and then character A walks in and stops it because character B starts with a monologue. And it's just that part, I think, is the only thing that I've been critical of, where I'm like, if you're going to kill this kid, then just do it. Don't sit there and talk about it. As she's walking in, finish your action. Maybe that's the only piece of evidence where I go, oh, it feels like he's an early writer in here. Because I think anytime writers do this, it feels cheap. Real bad guys, Osama bin Laden didn't sit here with a monologue before he did 9/11. He just did 9/11. In movies, we do this because we want exposition. Why is this character doing? Why is Thanos killing half the universe? He needs to explain it to us because we're human and we're dumb, and that's fine. But if it's going to be a horror book, and I'm not an expert in the genre, right? Horror books, I had to look up elements of horror books. It's having a fear factor, it's having suspense, building an atmosphere, supernatural elements. We've got that. We've got the suspense. We have a bit of a fear factor, psychological horror. There's gore. We have that. Themes of death and decay. We've got that. Isolation. We've got that. Helplessness, mystery, unknown, survival. So we have a lot of these things in this book. But I'm just always caught off. Have we just not discovered, and this isn't McCammon himself, but have we just not discovered better ways to reveal what bad guys want, except for pausing just before a final battle and giving a monologue?
I guess not. I mean, there are probably authors out there that have done this, and we just haven't run across them.
Or we didn't notice because it was so good.
Or we didn't notice it was so good.
And this isn't something I need you to answer. I'm just posing like, he's about to kill the kid. Just do it. Just throw him into the thing. Or start him as he's about to pick him up, and then, have him try and throw and miss, or like, because she stops him. Like, it's almost like editing a movie to me. Either start his action a little later so that she comes in and interrupts it, or start his action earlier and have it mid thing, and now the kid's half burned and she has justification for killing him. That one piece stood out to me. It seemed like change where you start and stop the action for that, just that one piece.
Yeah, no, you make good points. I'm trying to think back, the stuff that the kid does that seems off and is explicitly like underscored. Like, this is something that the kid is doing that's not normal. Like punching his mom with the wooden blocks, or throwing the wooden blocks at her, and then sucking on her blood. And then there's a couple of times he gives the adults like an eerie feeling, like the father doesn't know why he's turned off by the kid, because it's his kid, supposedly, and he's turned off by it. And then he stands over the kid with clenched fists. Now, even in world, that's explained because he never wanted this kid, and he thinks this is the end of his life, which the end of his life started where he, told his parents to screw off and decided to marry a waitress he had a fling with. So, whatever, buddy boy. It could be his contempt for the child because he didn't want a child, irrespective of whether he thinks it's his or not. But there's bits and moments where I think, it could be just my brain tricking me, but I think there's bits and moments in the book where we get like a sentence or half a sentence that Jeremy elicits feelings of unease in people. And that's probably where my brain goes to. Well, obviously, this is a demon kid or a demon in the vessel of a child, right? Using the child as a vessel, and he's destroying his family, just like the publisher's blurb said that I read in the beginning.
Yeah,
he drives them to kill each other.
he does drive them to things because we see that, and we don't have to sit on the past, Jeffrey, but we can move forward into Kuwait. Because another thing that stood out to me was oftentimes in supernatural books, and this doesn't mean that everybody has to do it, but it's just something that stood out to me, is there's no fight of will. So when you're asserting your will over a person, you're making them do something. And in supernatural books, it seems to be the case where you have to take over someone's will. Even in Star Wars that we read recently, where Bane has to take over Xana's will to sit in her body. Travis, the not reporter, there was no fight. He just killed a kid. Of his will. There was no fight of his will.
But he got so enthralled in the orgy and the overpowering sense of evil and dread. He was so drawn into that. He wakes up from whatever trance he was in, and he realized that he killed the kid. It wasn't like, oh, I'm killing a kid.
Mm-hmm. So you think? So you're saying that because there was a trance-like state, that there was not even an option for a fight of the will because he's in the territory that Baal controls to the extent that he just brings humans to, I guess we'll call it instinct, to function from instinct.
Yeah.
Based on his will. It's not even that he could fight. It's just, it's too overpowering.
Right. I think that's the case. Absolutely. Okay. That's why, because without spoiling anything, there's characters that fight back against Baal and are successful.
Oh, later. Oh, okay.
Later on, yeah. So I think Naughton is just weak-willed. He's different than the father, Mary Kate's taxi-driving husband, whoever his name is. Taxi driver. He has a taxi driver. Because he has a wife, he has a kid, he's happy in his marriage, he's successful, he has this mentor named Virga, and they're chummy, and it's good to be chummy with your mentor, like in this political academic world, because I've been there. So I can say with confidence that Naughton has it made. He gets a leave of absence to go travel and write his book, which is amazing for somebody that young in academia. There's to go like, hey, I'll go screw off, do whatever you want in Kuwait. But I knew he was cooked. I knew he was a weak-willed dude and an idealist, which is the worst type of guy to send to do an expose on some power-wielding, maniacal messiah figure who actually has the power to, conjure up supernatural elements or whatever,
manifestations.
Or manifestations. Yep. When Naughton is in a taxi with no windshield, and he sees the most depraved things, he gets all hot and bothered, and his heart starts overflowing with blood. Right, he starts bleeding from the heart, as they say, when he sees a guy being shot, and then the taxi driver passes by. Now, I'm not making any political or moral statements. I'm just saying the author, McCammon, at least to me, when he wrote that character, Naughton, and he put those words in his mouth and that righteous indignation, I'm like, oh, dude, you're gonna be Baal's little bitch, aren't you? That was for me like a little foreshadowing, because that guy always is the one who falls first. The idealist, the chest-thumping idealist, always falls first. When he visits the tent and he finally is in front of Baal, and all of a sudden he's naked and like inside an orgy, and then he wakes up from the orgasmic trance he was in, and he's like, oh crap, I killed a kid that I almost stepped on, that I kind of felt bad for about 17 and a half minutes ago, or whatever the hell long it took him to have the orgy. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why he was overtaken so easily.
Gotcha.
In my opinion.
Going back to my comment about no foreshadowing, I think that point you bring up is interesting and notable. I guess I'll find out if that ends up being true. I just kind of figure it is because you mentioned it. But another piece of foreshadowing that I think might be foreshadowing is when he's talking to his mentor and he's like, what happens if he ends up being a true Messiah? That could be another piece of foreshadowing, thinking back now that you brought it up.
Yeah. Do you remember what Naughton said to him?
His response?
Or to Naughton. What Virga said to Naughton. Because he says something interesting which could be seen as foreshadowing.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Oh, yeah, I found it. So, first of all, Naughton's first name is Donald, not Thomas or
Travis.
Terry. Travis. Where did you get Travis? That's funny.
I don't know.
No, whatever.
I thought it was Travis.
It's Baal's manifestations in your head.
Probably.
So here it is. Naughton turned again, and Virgo looked up. You know, sir, I find myself puzzling over the same question that men have asked themselves ever since the time of Jesus Christ. What if this one is different? What if this one isn't false? What then? If this is a false Messiah, Virga said after a moment, you'll be there to see how men can be tricked. If this is not a false Messiah, then, he smiled, you'll have a fascinating last chapter for your book, won't you?
Yeah, that does feel like foreshadowing, but could also be a red herring.
Mm-hmm. Because I won't spoil it for you. Yep, it's neither. Tune in next time when Jonathan finds out what happens in part 2 of Baal.
Neither. That's a weird thing to say, but all right. Sounds good. I don't know where I got Travis from. His name's Donald?
Donald Naughton, yeah. Because looking up this quote, I had to scroll past Virga talking to him, and he calls him Donald.
Is there anyone in the book named Travis?
I have no idea.
Did I read a different Baal book?
In a different dimension?
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Is Travis the stupid father's name?
I don't think so. Maybe.
Baal, Robert MacCammon, Travis. Fuck is Travis? Yeah, I don't see any Travis. Yeah, this book is so old it doesn't even have a decent wiki page for it. I don't know why not. But anyway, yep, it's Donald. Mr. Donald Naughton.
I don't know why I thought his name was Travis, but that's what I thought.
Well, you had me believe in it, so.
Great. Now, I feel like sometimes when you mispronounce words, I'm like, I'm not mispronouncing words. I'm just giving characters new names.
Hey, there you go. Excellent. Love it. So if we keep going here in the same vein, I think the next question, which you also bring up, is the absence of God. Because this is supposedly, two Catholics going to write about a book, one going to write a book on Baal, and then Virga goes after Naughton, and I won't spoil anything there, but he starts to pursue Naughton, because where you have left off in chapter 13, Naughton is under the spell of Baal.
Mm-hmm.
We can safely assume that he's going to be for a while, and that's why Virga in the next section, and this is not a spoiler at all, but Virga goes to see what's going on, because they don't hear from him for a bit. I'll tell you this, God is faintly seen throughout the book. I want to discuss that a little bit without, giving away too much in the second half, because I want you to discover it for yourself. So it's a two-part question. One, at least the way I'm reading your notes on it. One is, are the Catholics, meaning the Catholic leadership, like the Virga and others, are they two-dimensional kind of cutouts? I don't think so. I think they're middle-of-the-road, liberal, secular light, practicing only for traditional sakes type of Catholics. And that's just my description of them in world. I'm not making any statements, so keep off the keyboard, my warrior friends. And Robert MacCammon is not necessarily writing the same book that William Peter Blatty wrote. There's an incorporation of Revelation. There's an incorporation of Old Testament texts. But when Virga gets into the mix, because he starts talking about Job and talking about, Yahweh's fight with Baal. So there's these concepts that McCammon brings up. So to answer your question, no, I don't think the Catholics are two-dimensional. I think they're a particular type of Catholic. And they're not the type of weirdos that Paul Tremblay pulled out of I don't know what crack of his butt for Head Full of Ghosts, which are just completely just people like that exist. But Paul made a caricature of the worst type of stereotypical unlearned Christian and stuck it into that book. Here, I think it's just your typical well-educated, quasi-liberal, quasi-religious, academic folks who have a very academic interest in these things. So I think that's to answer your first question. And this question that follows or flows out of that is, why is there an absence of God? I'd like to discuss that. And I don't know Robert MacCannon's worldview or his religious affiliations or lack thereof, but maybe just because for him it's not an important piece of it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a strong driver here. I don't know what McCammon's well, it just doesn't seem like it's a main theme that he wants to unpack as much as he's trying to talk about a Messiah figure with supernatural powers, and God is not even tertiarily involved, which I think is interesting. But to do that, he does need Catholics in the story. So, yeah, it's just it's curious.
Yes, it is. I'm speculating here, but I don't think McCammon is trying to make a statement about God either way.
No, I don't think so either. I think it doesn't seem that way.
Right. He said that this is about power, and he wants to write about stuff he doesn't know, which is more about the locations that he chose. And he wants to write about how power corrupts, based on the stuff I read from his personal blog page. He probably had some sort of exposure to religion, just because that seems to make sense, right?
He's from the South, right? Arkansas?
Yeah. So he must have had some sort of exposure to religion in the South. And I think he did use some of what he knows, because you can't avoid that. So he wanted to make this a statement about a person with ultimate power and able to even influence other people to do his bidding, what that would look like. And naturally, as a writer, he did some research on Baal and the Old Testament and even some New Testament theology, because he uses the book of Revelation a lot in some of the epithets, like really short epithets in some of the chapters. So he used what was around him, because in the 80s, late 70s, all through the 80s, early 90s, there was a fervor in evangelicalism, and the hotbed of evangelicalism is the South. That's where mainstream Christianity lives, I suppose. So he was probably looking at the stuff around him and pulled in ideas from memory and from experience, just like he writes on his on his blog. And I think a story was born in his head. So my fully admitted guess here is he wanted to write a story about power, and based on what he knew, this was the best vehicle for it, a religious figure of the mnemonic stripe taking over the world. But I'm also reserving some of my thoughts because I don't want to spoil the rest of the book for you. Not that that's to say God shows up at the end in, some kind of miraculous way, but
Jesus comes down on Jacob's ladder at Bethel and drives out Baal from Jeffrey, and then Jeffrey comes back to his mother in the prison, and they're reconciled, and just for cheap thrills, Jesus resurrects taxi driver, and they all live happily ever after.
Travis the taxi driver. Yeah, none of that happens. But there are religious elements that are pulled in, and they're very interesting, because I really want to know Robert MacCammon's religious history, like his exposure to it, because the way he weaves certain things in the second book, it's just fascinating. It sparks curiosity in me. That's all for now.
Interesting. Okay. And you said this is the only book of his you read?
The only one, yeah. But there's one more that I have on my wish list that's supposedly his second or third that's also very creepy supernatural horror, but this is the only one.
When did you read this for the first time?
Right after Head Full of Ghosts. So maybe a year and a half ago.
Okay. Interesting. Because you're a horror aficionado, what horror elements do you find the most riveting in horror genre books?
Very good question. What I like is the psychological kind of elements, psychological fears. I like suspense, a supernatural type of suspense where Baal, as a kid, Baal in the orphanage, when he gets his little minions together, you get a sense of the creepiness of Baal. There's this foreboding feeling that you get as you read it. So for me, I like supernatural horror. I like psychological horror. I'm not much into torture porn or gore or even slasher stuff. I watched it. It's funny. I like Friday the 13th as much as the next guy because I think it's silly. I'm more of, Nightmare on Elm Street, Exorcist, stuff like that, where it's more psychological and surreal. And that goes back to the why I love speculative fiction and sci-fi and weird off the beaten path type of nonsense. I like to be unsettled when I read stuff. And so I don't find a lot of books that could do that for me. So this one did it. The psychological kind of aspect of this, the unknown, and when something does include Christianity in its story, I like when it's presented at least correctly. Whether or not it's a critique, I don't care about that. We've discussed that in The Head Full of Ghosts. I'm not offended by somebody critiquing my religion in a fictional book. Like, I could care less. My ego's not that big. Here, despite my uncertainty of Robert MacCammon's kind of like religious outlook or his history there, he seems to present people really well. And I'm like, yeah, this is what a professor of theology you'd probably do in these situations. Well, I'm getting off track a little bit. What elements? I think those two are the ones that are most important to me. I always look for that, where the psychological element of it is done well, where there's the sense of eeriness and imagery. Like, right, when the guy writes well, like Robert Naughton, when he describes just the feeling that Travis, the taxi driver, whatever his name is, feels with being won over, like defeated by his wife. And I'm on Mary Kate's side in this. I'm not on his side, but just the descriptions are powerful. So when those are done right, that psychological element comes out, the suspense comes out, and I like supernatural stuff. I really like anything to do with religion and supernatural elements in my horror.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, especially with your background and all that jazz.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to throw it back to you, but with a little bit different twist, if you will. Being a new-ish reader of horror, what are some of those elements that you found surprisingly appealing? Like, you going into horror, maybe you never thought about it, and you're like, oh, wow, this particular thing about the horror books, at least the ones we read.
Well, we haven't dove into this exactly yet, but with it, and then here with Baal, the supernatural element definitely catches my attention because it feels like magic systems. And we didn't get to talk about this in terms of Head Full of Ghosts, but one of the books that's on Mary's shelf, Pigs in the Parlor, I've actually read that whole book. It's a Christian exorcist / deliverance minister book. I used to read a bunch of things about angels and demons as a kid. So the supernatural side definitely sticks out to me, but I am very quickly captivated by it. So I actually oftentimes just stay away from things that are too close to truth in the supernatural realm, usually, which is why I moved into fantasy, because it's like, oh, this is all just fake stuff, but fun still, fun magic systems and things like that. So I knew that I was drawn to more supernatural things because I have a propensity to look for hidden knowledge. It's just something that's always intrigued me, and so I actually don't allow myself to go look at hidden knowledge because it's not going to lead me where I want to go as a person, which is less of an answer about horror books and more of an answer about who I am as a person. The knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Wow, I'm a Christian.
The tree of the knowledge
there it is.
Of good and evil.
There it is. Right. That's what I was trying to say. I try not to eat from it. So in terms of horror as a genre overall, I think that a lot of books that I read don't have enough mystery in them. So I think I'd say that that's definitely something that sticks out. Or suspense. I think that suspense is difficult to write today because we're so inundated by social media and everything is a shock and awe, hook, shock, awe type thing that happens on social media in 14 seconds because we don't have the attention spans anymore. That when you read an older book like this from the 80s, it's impressive to go, oh wow, he's building some suspense here. Okay, all right. I don't know what's going to happen, but there's some growing suspense. So I'd say the supernatural elements and then the suspense elements are certainly up there in terms of the horror genre as a whole.
Love it. Love it.
All right. Well, that covers most of it. Today's a bit of a shorter episode because I've got some stuff I've got to get out schedule-wise to do. So thanks for tuning in today, listening to us discuss Baal, and be sure to tune in next time where I finish reading the book as a first-time reader, and we discuss whatever happens in the remaining part of the book.
Do us a favor. Take a moment and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. That helps us get in front of more listeners. And also, make sure to share it with your book-loving friends. We'll see you next time here on SideQuest.